A millionaire finds a pair of homeless twins on New Year's Eve and takes them home. The next day, a man knocks down the millionaire's door, leaving him speechless. The streets of Boston pulsed with life, a chaotic symphony of laughter, cheers, and the occasional blaring horn of impatient drivers trapped in celebratory gridlock. Thomas Holland stood apart from it all, his shoulders hunched against the cold, the collar of his wool coat pulled high. The world around him glowed. Neon signs reflecting on wet pavement, festive lights strung across storefronts. But Thomas felt none of its warmth. His hands were buried deep in his coat pockets, his fingers brushing against the worn leather edge of Peter's picture, always there like a talisman. A sharp gust of wind tugged at his scarf, and he tightened it absent-mindedly, his gaze fixed ahead, but unseeing. Emma would have loved a night like this, he thought. She'd have pulled him into the crowds, her cheeks pink from the cold, Peter's tiny hand clasped in hers. He could almost hear their laughter, feel Peter's weight as the boy begged to be carried when his legs grew tired. The memory flickered like an old film reel, fleeting and grainy, before dissolving into the ache that had become his constant companion these past 2 years. A sharp pop echoed through the streets, followed by a shower of gold fireworks above. The crowd roared in delight, their voices rising in a countdown. 10, 9, 8. Thomas's stride faltered as a sound cut through the noise. It wasn't the laughter of revelers or the crackle of fireworks. It was something softer, rawer, crying. 7, 6. He hesitated, scanning the bustling street. No one else seemed to notice. The sound tugged at him, faint but insistent, drawing him toward a narrow alley, veiled in shadow. 5, 4. The alley was damp, its walls slick with grime. The crying grew louder, punctuated by muffled sniffles. He stepped carefully, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement. A faint movement caught his eye, a small bundle huddled against the far wall. 3, 2. Thomas crouched, his heart thudding in his chest as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. 2 children sat pressed together, their thin bodies wrapped in a single threadbare blanket. The boy, younger by a year or 2, clung to the girl's arm, his face buried in her shoulder. She glared at Thomas, her large dark eyes sharp with mistrust, her frame stiff and protective. 1. Happy New Year! The city erupted in cheers, fireworks painting the sky in streaks of red and blue. The boy whimpered at the noise, his small hands clutching the girl tighter. "Hey," Thomas said softly, his voice barely audible over the distant celebration. He held his hands up, palms open, in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The girl said nothing, her gaze never leaving his. Her jaw was set, her eyes far older than they should have been. "You're freezing," Thomas continued, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Let me help you." "No," the girl snapped, her voice trembling but firm. "We're fine." Thomas glanced at the boy. His small face, streaked with dirt, was pale and gaunt. The boy's thin frame shivered violently, his breaths ragged. "You don't look fine," Thomas said gently. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, her lips tightening into a thin line. Finally, she said, "Clara," her voice barely audible over a whisper. "And that's Simon." "Clara, Simon," Thomas repeated, tasting the names like a prayer. "You shouldn't be out here. It's too cold. Come with me. I can give you something warm to eat and a place to rest." Clara shook her head quickly. "We don't need your help." Simon stirred, lifting his face to peek at Thomas. His eyes, wide and filled with a fragile curiosity, met Thomas's for a brief moment, before retreating behind Clara's shoulder. "Please," Thomas tried again, his voice firmer, but still kind. "I can't just leave you here. It's New Year's Eve. Let me help." Clara's grip on Simon tightened. She looked at him, then back at Thomas, weighing her options. Her lips trembled, and for the first time, her bravado cracked. "You won't call anyone?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling. "No one," Thomas promised. "Just me. I want to help." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then, with a reluctant nod, she slowly stood, pulling Simon to his feet. The boy stumbled slightly, and Thomas reached out instinctively, steadying him. Clara flinched, but didn't pull away. "My car's just outside," Thomas said, leading them out of the alley. The fireworks were fading now, leaving behind trails of smoke that lingered like ghosts. As they stepped into the street, the lights of the city seemed a little dimmer, the crowds thinning. Thomas glanced down at the two small figures beside him, their faces pale but determined. This, he realized, wasn't how he'd planned to spend the evening. But something about Clara's fierce resolve and Simon's quiet vulnerability stirred something in him, a flicker of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and for the first time since Emma and Peter, Thomas felt a tiny, fragile ember of hope. The mansion loomed in the soft glow of the porch light, its tall windows gazing blankly into the night. Thomas unlocked the door, the echo of the deadbolt turning, cutting through the silence. Pushing it open, he stepped aside to let Clara and Simon enter first. They hesitated, their silhouettes fragile against the doorway. Clara's grip on Simon's hand tightened, her sharp eyes darting into the dark expanse of the house as if it were a predator waiting to pounce. "It's just a house," Thomas said, his tone quiet but firm, trying to disarm the tension. "Go ahead, it's warm inside." Clara stepped in cautiously, pulling Simon close. The boy stumbled slightly, his thin legs unsteady on the polished wood floors. Thomas followed, switching on the lights. A soft glow filled the room, revealing high ceilings, intricate moldings, and furniture that seemed untouched by time. The house carried the weight of absence. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, illuminated by the chandelier overhead. Photographs lined the mantel, frozen moments of a family now fractured. Emma's smile was everywhere, her warmth preserved in each frame. And Peter, with his unruly curls, beamed from a dozen candid shots. Simon's gaze wandered to one of the photos, his head tilting as he studied it. Clara tugged at his arm, redirecting him, her expression tight with unspoken warning. "Here," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "Let me take your coats." Clara hesitated, her fingers clinging to the threadbare fabric of her jacket. Finally, she shrugged it off, revealing a too-thin sweater beneath. Simon followed her lead, his movements sluggish. Thomas hung their coats by the door and motioned toward the living room. "You can sit," he offered. Clara guided Simon to the couch, but remained on the edge, her posture rigid. Simon pressed into her side, his small hands clutching her arm. Thomas watched them for a moment, the tension between them palpable, as if the air around them had been drawn tight. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Simon nodded faintly, but Clara's expression hardened. "We're fine," she said quickly. Thomas crouched slightly, lowering himself to their eye level. "You don't have to be fine," he said softly, his gaze steady, but not overbearing. "Let me get you something to eat." Clara didn't answer, her jaw tight, but she didn't stop him either. Taking her silence as consent, Thomas moved to the kitchen. He worked quickly, pulling together something simple, a couple of grilled cheese sandwiches and steaming mugs of hot chocolate. The act of cooking steadied him, grounding him in the present. Yet his mind wandered. He'd noticed it the moment they crossed the threshold, Clara's gaze. The way her eyes moved, scanning the room with a precision that was too sharp for her age. There was something in the set of her jaw, the flicker of her expression that stirred a strange familiarity. He shook it off. Coincidence, he told himself. When he returned, Clara was still in the same spot, her hand resting lightly on Simon's shoulder. He set the tray on the coffee table and stepped back, keeping his movements measured and unthreatening. "Eat," he said. Simon hesitated, but reached for a sandwich, the golden crust crumbling slightly in his small hands. He nibbled cautiously, as if afraid it might be taken away. Clara remained still, her eyes flicking between Thomas and Simon. Finally, she grabbed the other sandwich, her grip firm but controlled. Thomas sank into a chair across from them, watching without speaking. The silence was thick, but not oppressive. The crackle of the fire in the hearth filled the space, its warmth slowly seeping into the room. As Simon finished his sandwich, his gaze wandered again, this time landing on a larger photograph on the far wall. In it, a woman stood with a bright smile, her arms around a younger Thomas and a petite brunette woman. Clara's eyes followed his, locking onto the same image. Her body stiffened. She quickly looked away, her expression unreadable. Thomas didn't notice. His attention was elsewhere, on Simon's small hands clutching the empty mug, on Clara's guarded posture that seemed to shield them both from something unseen. "You don't have to tell me anything tonight," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice even. "But you're safe here. No one will bother you. You have my word." Clara glanced at him, her eyes sharp and searching, as though weighing the truth of his words. She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed the slightest bit, a crack in the armor she wore so tightly. Thomas leaned back, his gaze lingering on the photograph Clara had noticed earlier. Pamela's smile. His sister stared back at him, her presence vivid even in the stillness of the image. However, he hadn't yet made the connection. The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the fire casting long shadows across the walls. Thomas sat in the stillness, letting the weight of the night settle, unaware that the children he'd brought into his home carried not just their own secrets, but pieces of a past that would soon intertwine with his in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The next morning arrived slowly, the winter light filtering through the tall windows of Thomas's home. He awoke early, the house still steeped in an almost oppressive silence. The memory of Clara's guarded eyes and Simon's fragile figure stayed with him as he prepared coffee, the familiar routine offering little comfort. When he peeked into the living room, he found Clara sitting upright on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her. Simon was still asleep, his head resting on her lap, his small body curled into himself. Clara's eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the embers of the dying fire. "Good morning," Thomas said quietly, careful not to startle her. Clara's head turned slowly, her gaze sharp but wary. She didn't respond, only nodded slightly. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, stepping into the room with deliberate slowness. Thomas sat in the stillness, letting the weight of the night settle, unaware that the children he'd brought into his home carried not just their own secrets, but pieces of a past that would soon intertwine with his in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The next morning arrived slowly, the winter light filtering through the tall windows of Thomas's home. He awoke early, the house still steeped in an almost oppressive silence. The memory of Clara's guarded eyes and Simon's fragile figure stayed with him as he prepared coffee, the familiar routine offering little comfort. When he peeked into the living room, he found Clara sitting upright on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her. Simon was still asleep, his head resting on her lap, his small body curled into himself. Clara's eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the embers of the dying fire. "Good morning," Thomas said quietly, careful not to startle her. Clara's head turned slowly, her gaze sharp but wary. She didn't respond, only nodded slightly. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, stepping into the room with deliberate slowness. Simon looked up from his plate, his wide eyes darting between Clara and Thomas. Thomas nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I see," he said, not pressing further. The guarded wall around Clara was almost palpable, and he knew better than to push. Instead, he shifted the conversation. "What about before the orphanage? Do you remember anything?" Clara shook her head quickly. "We've always been there," she said, her voice taut. The lie was obvious, but Thomas didn't call her out on it. Simon tugged at Clara's sleeve. "We had he began, his voice soft, but Clara silenced him with a firm glance. "Enough, Simon," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. Simon ducked his head, returning to his food. Thomas didn't miss the exchange. Something had happened before the orphanage, something they weren't ready to share. That afternoon, Thomas found himself in his study, sifting through old files. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but he felt compelled to search. His mind kept returning to Clara's face, her movements, the subtle defiance in her voice. There was something about her he couldn't shake, a familiarity that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. His hands brushed against a stack of papers that had belonged to Emma. He hadn't touched her things since the accident. The sight of her neat handwriting brought a lump to his throat. But he forced himself to look through them. Midway through the stack, he paused. One page in particular caught his eye, Emma's notes about her visits to a local orphanage. He scanned the lines, his brow furrowing as he read her observations. 2 children, a boy and a girl, very close in age. There's something about them. The girl reminds me of Pamela. It's in her eyes. But that can't be possible, can it? Thomas froze, his breath catching in his throat. Pamela. He hadn't thought of her in that context for years, but now his mind raced, replaying Clara's sharp eyes and protective demeanor, the way she carried herself with a maturity far beyond her years. Could it be? He shook his head, trying to temper the wild thought. It was absurd, wasn't it? He rubbed his temples, the beginnings of a headache forming. Yet the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing quickly. That evening, Thomas sat in his armchair, staring into the fire. Clara and Simon had retreated to the guest room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He turned Emma's notes over in his hands, reading and rereading the words until they blurred together. The idea was impossible, and yet the photograph from the living room flickered in his mind. Pamela's smile, her arm looped through his, their bond unshakable, even after all these years. He thought of her tragic end, the way her light had been snuffed out too soon. If there was even a sliver of a chance that Clara and Simon were hers. Thomas set the papers down, his resolve hardening. He needed answers, and he wouldn't stop until he found them. The orphanage sat on the outskirts of Boston, a squat, weathered building crouched beneath a canopy of skeletal winter trees. Its bricks were faded, streaked with grime and neglect, and the sign above the door hung lopsided, its letters worn thin. Thomas stood on the cracked pavement, staring at the structure as unease rippled through him. The wind nipped at his cheeks, but he remained motionless, the weight of what he might discover immovable. A part of him wanted to turn back, to let the questions about Clara and Simon remain unanswered. But Emma's notes, the memory of Pamela's smile, and the guarded look in Clara's eyes wouldn't let him. He stepped inside. The interior was no better than the exterior. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and the fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically. A receptionist sat behind a scratched desk, her expression as weary as the building itself. She barely looked up as Thomas approached. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone flat. "I'm looking for information about 2 children," Thomas began, keeping his voice steady. "Clara and Simon. They stayed here recently." The receptionist's eyes flicked to him, sharp and assessing. "I'm not authorized to give out information," she said curtly. Thomas clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm not asking for much. Just a few details. Anything you can tell me." The woman hesitated, her gaze lingering on his tailored coat and polished demeanor. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward a narrow hallway. "You'll want to speak to Ms. Harper." She was in charge of their case. Ms. Harper's office was as bleak as the rest of the building, a cramped space lined with mismatched filing cabinets. The woman herself was older, her grey-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked up from a stack of papers as Thomas entered, her expression guarded. "You're here about Clara and Simon?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Yes," Thomas said. "They've been staying with me. I need to understand more about what they've been through." Miss Harper leaned back in her chair, studying him. "They didn't tell you anything?" "Not much," Thomas admitted. "Only that they ran away." Miss Harper's lips thinned. "It doesn't surprise me. That girl, Clara, she's fiercely protective of her brother. She wouldn't let anyone near them, not even her." Thomas nodded, filing the observation away. "Why were they here in the first place?" "Abandoned," Miss Harper said simply, though her tone carried an edge of frustration. "Dropped off with no explanation. We tried to place them, but they were difficult." Thomas's stomach tightened. Difficult. "They didn't trust anyone," Ms. Harper clarified. "Clara especially, and Simon. Well, he's been through a lot. They were here longer than most, which wasn't ideal." She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "There was a woman who visited them often. Kimberly, I believe her name was." Thomas froze, his heart racing. "Kimberly?" he repeated, his voice barely audible above a whisper. "Yes," Ms. Harper said, her brow furrowing. "She claimed to be concerned about their well-being, but she wasn't family. We thought she might be interested in adopting them, but she never pursued it. She just lingered." The air in the room seemed to grow colder. Thomas's mind raced, fragments of memory crashing together. Kimberly's watchful eyes, her unspoken tension around Pamela, her abrupt departure from the Holland household under a cloud of suspicion. "Do you know anything else about her?" he asked, his voice tightening. Miss Harper shook her head. "Not much. She never gave us details, and frankly, we didn't have the resources to dig deeper." Thomas left the orphanage with more questions than answers. The wind stung his face as he walked back to his car, but he barely felt it. Kimberly. He hadn't thought about her in years, but now her name lingered like a shadow, creeping into the edges of his thoughts. She had been the Holland family's trusted housekeeper once, a quiet but constant presence. But Pamela's children had vanished, and Kimberly had left the household shortly after. Her departure had raised eyebrows, but there had been no evidence to tie her to the tragedy. Now, the pieces seemed to be falling into place, though the picture they formed was far from clear. Why had Kimberly visited Simon and Clara at the orphanage? What was her connection to them? Thomas gripped the steering wheel as he sat in his car, the weight of his growing suspicions pressing down on him. If Kimberly had been involved in the disappearance of Pamela's children, he shook his head, attempting to quiet the tumultuous thoughts. He needed proof. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost, a sense of purpose. He would find out the truth. He owed it to Pamela, to Emma, to Clara and Simon, and to himself. The wind stung his face as he walked back to his car, but he barely felt it. Kimberly. He hadn't thought about her in years, but now her name lingered like a shadow, creeping into the edges of his thoughts. She had been the Holland family's trusted housekeeper once, a quiet but constant presence. But Pamela's children had vanished, and Kimberly had left the household shortly after. Her departure had raised eyebrows, but there had been no evidence to tie her to the tragedy. Now, the pieces seemed to be falling into place, though the picture they formed was far from clear. Why had Kimberly visited Simon and Clara at the orphanage? What was her connection to them? Thomas gripped the steering wheel as he sat in his car, the weight of his growing suspicions pressing down on him. If Kimberly had been involved in the disappearance of Pamela's children— He shook his head, attempting to quiet the tumultuous thoughts. He needed proof. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost, a sense of purpose. He would find out the truth. He owed it to Pamela, to Emma, to Clara and Simon, and to himself. Pamela, newly married and still adjusting to life with her husband, seemed oblivious, her trusting nature shielding her from Kimberly's growing fixation. Thomas remembered one evening in particular, sitting in the study with a glass of scotch. Kimberly had come in to collect a tray, her movements brisk but oddly tense. "Do you need anything else, Mr. Holland?" she'd asked, her eyes darting toward the door, where James and Pamela's laughter echoed faintly. "No," Thomas had replied, watching her carefully. She hesitated, her gaze lingering toward the sound, before she forced a smile and left. It wasn't long after that the subtle cracks in her facade became harder to ignore. Kimberly grew increasingly possessive of her role in the household, often inserting herself into moments she didn't belong. Susan, their mother, had been the first to express concern. "She watches Pamela too closely," Susan had confided to Thomas one evening, her tone hushed. "And James, there's something off about her interest in him." Thomas had brushed it off at the time, dismissing it as paranoia, but now, as the memories resurfaced, Susan's words rang with a clarity he couldn't ignore. The journal. Thomas pulled Susan's journal from the old chest in the study, its leather cover cracked with age. He hadn't opened it in years, but he knew it might hold the answers he sought. The entries were meticulous, Susan's neat handwriting detailing the daily rhythms of the household. As Thomas flipped through the pages, her observations about Kimberly grew sharper, tinged with unease. "She's always around Pamela, too eager to help. And James? She watches him with such intensity. I told Pamela, but she just laughed it off. Perhaps I'm imagining things." Further down the page, another entry stood out. "I caught Kimberly in the nursery today, organizing things that didn't need organizing. Pamela doesn't even know she's expecting yet. How could Kimberly have known? I can't shake the feeling that she's planning something. I must speak to Thomas about this." Thomas sat back, his breath shallow. The journal was a window into the growing tension Susan had felt, her instincts warning her of something no one else had seen. Kimberly had left shortly after these entries were written, her departure abrupt and unexplained. But the timeline matched. Pamela hadn't been visibly pregnant at the time, but Kimberly had suspected, perhaps even before Pamela herself had known. The pieces were aligning, but not enough to form a complete picture. Kimberly's abrupt departure from the household after years of service, the disappearance of Pamela's children, her re-emergence in the lives of Clara and Simon, lingering at the orphanage without clear intent. Thomas clenched his fists, the weight of the growing suspicion pressing heavily on his chest. Kimberly had been in their lives long enough to know their patterns, their vulnerabilities. She had inserted herself where she wasn't wanted, and when she was finally cast out, she hadn't gone quietly. But he still lacked proof. Thomas closed the journal carefully, his mind racing. If Kimberly was involved in Pamela's tragedy, and if she had a hand in Clara and Simon's suffering, he needed to find her. The truth couldn't stay buried any longer. The fire in the hearth burned low as Thomas sat in the dimly lit study, Susan's journal resting on the table beside him. The shadows danced across the walls, mirroring the chaos in his mind. He thought of Pamela's laugh, her easy smile, and the way she had always turned to him when she needed support. He owed it to her to uncover the truth. He thought of Clara, her guarded eyes hiding years of pain, of Simon, his small frame curling into itself like a wilted flower. They deserved answers too, answers Thomas was determined to find. For the first time in years, he felt a fire stir within him, burning away the fog of grief and guilt that had consumed him since Emma and Peter's deaths. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about justice for Pamela, for her children, and for a family that had been fractured too many times. Thomas leaned forward, his jaw set. He would find Kimberly, and when he did, she would have no place to hide. The knock on the door came late in the evening, sharp and deliberate. Thomas, still sitting in the study, looked up with a start. The house had been unnervingly quiet since Clara and Simon had retreated to their room, and the sudden noise felt almost intrusive. He rose slowly, his mind racing. He wasn't expecting anyone. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment before turning the knob. James Holland stood on the porch, his face gaunt and pale in the dim light. His once vibrant demeanor had been replaced with something far heavier, an expression weighed down by years of regret and exhaustion. Snow clung to his coat and dark hair, and his brown eyes, so familiar and yet so distant, met Thomas's. Thomas spoke, his voice barely audible above a whisper. "James." James gave a small, tight nod. "Hello, Thomas." The brothers sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly between them. James held his hands close to the warmth, though his posture remained tense, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. "I know I should have come sooner," James began, his voice hoarse, "but I didn't know how. Not after everything." Thomas studied him, the years of silence between them palpable. "Why are you here now?" he asked, his tone neutral, but laced with curiosity. James hesitated, running a hand through his damp hair. "I've been watching," he admitted. "For years, I've been trying to piece together what happened to Pamela, to the children." Thomas stiffened. "Watching? What do you mean?" "I've been following Kimberly," James said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Ever since she left the house, I've had my suspicions. I knew she was involved somehow, but I could never prove it. She disappeared for a while, then resurfaced at that orphanage." Thomas's heart raced. "You knew she was visiting Clara and Simon?" James nodded, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know their names. I only saw her going there, lingering. At first I thought she might have taken them, that they were my children." His voice cracked and he paused, visibly struggling to steady himself. Thomas leaned forward, his own emotions a mix of shock and frustration. "Why didn't you do something? If you suspected—" "I didn't have proof," James snapped, his voice rising. He exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "Do you think I didn't want to? That I didn't lie awake every night, hating myself for not acting? But what was I supposed to do? Walk into that place and demand answers I didn't have?" Thomas fell silent, the weight of James's words sinking in. "I found out about them being here," James continued, his tone quieter now. "With you. I didn't know how to approach you after all this time, after everything that's happened, but I couldn't stay away anymore. We hope this story reaches you by the end of the year so that the pain of the characters will not haunt us into the new year. If you hear this story before January 1st, 2025, please comment orange. Otherwise, write Mandarin orange. The silence that followed was thick, the firelight casting flickering shadows across their faces. "They're upstairs," Thomas said finally, his voice low. "Clara and Simon." James's eyes widened slightly, the vulnerability in his expression almost childlike. "Can I see them?" Thomas hesitated, but nodded. They're sleeping. But you can... Look. James nodded, his throat working as he swallowed. I need to see them. Thomas hesitated. Clara's guarded nature and Simon's vulnerability flashed through his mind. But then he saw the raw desperation in James's eyes and nodded. The sight of Clara and Simon asleep in the guest room stole the breath from James's lungs. He stood in the doorway, his hands trembling at his sides as he took in their small, fragile forms. Clara's arm was draped protectively over Simon, even in sleep, her brow furrowed as though still on guard. They look just like her, James whispered, his voice breaking. Like Pamela. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze fixed on James. You're sure? James nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. I can't explain it, Thomas. But I know they're hers. The words settled heavily in the room. Thomas felt the familiar tug of doubt, but it was quickly overshadowed by something stronger, a deep, gut-wrenching certainty. Back in the study, the fire had burned down to embers. James sat hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, while Thomas paced the room, the journal clutched in his hands. You said you suspected Kimberly, Thomas said, his voice tight. Why didn't you do anything? James's head dropped. I tried, he said hoarsely. After Pamela died, I looked into her, tried to track her down. But she disappeared, and there was no proof, no trail. Every lead became inactive. Thomas stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. But you knew she was dangerous. I did, James admitted, his voice filled with self-loathing. And I failed to protect Pamela. I failed to protect her children. Thomas's jaw tightened, his frustration warring with the flicker of understanding he felt toward James. The guilt in his voice was unmistakable, the pain raw. We can't change what happened, Thomas said finally, his tone hardening with resolve. But we can find her now. Kimberly's still out there, James. And if she's responsible for what happened to Pamela's children, for what happened to Clara and Simon, we'll make sure she pays. James looked up, the firelight catching in his eyes. You're certain it's her? Thomas handed him Susan's journal. Read this, he said. Then tell me you don't think she's capable of everything we've suspected, and worse. James took the journal, his hands trembling as he opened it. As he read, his expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. I should have stopped her, he muttered, his voice thick with regret. I should have seen it back then. You didn't, Thomas said bluntly. But we can stop her now. James nodded, sank into the chair, his hands trembling. We need to know for sure, he said, his voice resolute. DNA testing. I need proof. Thomas nodded, the same determination mirrored in his own expression. I'll arrange it. James looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, Thomas, for taking them in, for everything. Thomas shook his head. This isn't about me. It's about them, and about finding the truth. James leaned back, exhaling shakily. Kimberly's not going to stop, you know. If she's as involved as we think, she'll do whatever it takes to keep her secrets buried. Then we'll dig them up, Thomas said firmly, together. For the first time in years, the two brothers sat side by side, united not by grief, but by purpose. The weight of the past still loomed heavy between them, but the flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, burned brighter than it had in a long time. The envelope arrived the next morning, its edges crisp and sterile, bearing the weight of a truth long buried. Thomas sat in the study, the envelope trembling slightly in his hands, as James paced the room, his steps heavy with anticipation. Open it, James said, his voice rough and barely audible. Thomas broke the seal, his heart pounding as he unfolded the document inside. His eyes scanned the page, catching on the words that confirmed what he had already suspected. "It's them," Thomas said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Clara and Simon, they're yours." For a moment, James said nothing, his pacing halting as he stared at Thomas. Then he sank into the chair opposite, his face a mixture of relief, disbelief, and guilt. When James approached Clara and Simon in the living room later, he moved cautiously, his presence hesitant yet filled with purpose. The children sat together on the couch, Simon nestled close to Clara's side. "Clara," James began, his voice trembling. "Simon, I'm your father." Clara stiffened, her protective instincts flaring. Her sharp eyes scanned James, searching for deception. "You're lying," she said flatly, though her voice wavered. Simon looked up, his small hands clutching Clara's sleeve. "Our father?" he whispered, his tone more curious than accusing. James knelt before them, his gaze level and earnest. "I've been looking for you both. For so long. I never gave up. And now, you're here." For a moment, there was only silence. Then Simon leaned forward, his small hand reaching hesitantly toward James. Clara stayed frozen, her jaw tight, but her eyes glistened. James gently took Simon's hand, his voice breaking as he said, "I'm so sorry for everything." Clara's walls finally cracked. She let out a shaky breath, her voice small. "You're really him?" James nodded, tears streaming freely now. "Yes, I'm your dad, and I'm never letting you go again." Simon threw himself into James's arms, and after a long pause, Clara followed, her grip tight and desperate. For the first time in years, they felt the fragile warmth of family returning. From the shadowed corner of the street, Kimberly watched the Holland mansion. Her breath fogged in the cold night air, but the chill didn't bother her. She was too consumed by the scene unfolding before her. The silhouette of James stepping through the door, the faint glow of the living room light illuminating his figure as the door closed behind him. He was back. Kimberly's lips curled into a slow, triumphant smile, her gloved hands tightening around the edges of her coat. He had returned, just as she always knew he would. Inside her mind, the years unraveled like an old, worn-out thread, each memory pulling her deeper into her obsession. Kimberly had come to the Hollands young, wide-eyed, and eager to prove herself. But it hadn't taken long for her to notice James, the way he carried himself, his quiet charm, his effortless kindness. He had been everything she wasn't, confident, steady, loved. At first, she told herself it was admiration, but admiration quickly soured into fixation. She had watched him with Pamela, her perfect little life falling into place, and Kimberly had been there for all of it. The wedding preparations, the honeymoon return, Pamela's soft laughter echoing through the house. It had been unbearable. James should have been hers. The thought grew like a vine, wrapping around her heart and squeezing tighter with every passing day. She had worked hard to stay indispensable to the family, weaving herself into their lives until it seemed impossible to remove her. But Susan had seen through her, always watching, always interfering. Kimberly's lip twitched at the memory of the older woman's thinly veiled accusations. She always thought she was so clever. Then came the news Kimberly hadn't expected. Pamela was pregnant. Kimberly had known before Pamela herself did, noticing the subtle changes, the glow. It was a blow, sharper than anything she'd felt before. She had thought James might finally see her if Pamela stumbled, but with children on the way, her chances were slipping further away. So she had acted. Kimberly's smile faded as her gaze moved to the upstairs window. The children were there. She hadn't been able to resist checking on them, visiting the orphanage over the years to ensure they were safe. Or rather, to ensure they were still hers to control. She had seen them grow from helpless infants to wary, quiet children, always sticking close to each other. Clara was too much like Pamela for Kimberly's comfort, sharp-eyed, protective, and fiercely independent. But Simon had potential. He was malleable, vulnerable. If only she could get close to him without Clara interfering. Her mind darkened as her thoughts shifted to Emma. The woman had been too curious, too kind-hearted. Emma had suspected the truth, or at least pieces of it, and Kimberly had known she couldn't let her dig deeper. The accident hadn't been part of the original plan, but it had been necessary. Emma had left Kimberly no choice. Kimberly took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for James to come back, waiting for him to see her sacrifices, to understand why she had done it all. For him, for them. He would see it now. But first, there was Thomas. Kimberly's jaw tightened. He had always been the hardest to fool, even back when she had worked in the house. She could still picture his watchful eyes, his careful questions. He was dangerous in his own quiet way. And now, he had the children. A flicker of doubt crept into her mind. What if James turned against her? What if he believed Thomas's lies? No. Kimberly straightened, her resolve hardening. James wasn't like Thomas. James would understand. He would see that everything she had done, taking the children, removing Pamela, even the accident, had been for him. Her fingers brushed the inside pocket of her coat, where a photograph of Simon and Clara lay tucked away. She had taken it years ago, on one of her visits to the orphanage. It was faded now, but she kept it close, a reminder of her dedication. The mansion lights flickered as someone moved from one room to another. Kimberly's heartbeat quickened. She could feel the moment approaching, the inevitable confrontation that would either vindicate her or destroy her. "They'll see," she whispered to herself, her breath misting in the air. "He'll see." For a moment, her expression softened, almost dreamy, as she imagined James's face when he finally understood. He would forgive her. He would have to. Once he saw how far she was willing to go for him. For them, there would be no denying her place in his life. Her smile returned, but it was sharper now, edged with the instability that had been growing within her for years. It wouldn't be long. Soon, everything would fall into place. The front door slammed open, the sharp crack of wood and metal echoing through the silent mansion. Kimberly stood in the doorway, her chest heaving from the cold and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Snow clung to her dark coat, but her eyes burned with fervor as she stepped inside, ignoring the startled voices from deeper within the house. "Kimberly?" Thomas's voice cut through the tension as he appeared from the study, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "What are you doing here?" Kimberly's lips curved into a small, trembling smile. "I had to see him," she said softly, her eyes darting past Thomas as James stepped into view. Her breath caught, and for a moment her mask of confidence wavered. "James." James froze at the base of the staircase, his face hardening. "Kimberly, what do you think you're doing?" She took a step closer, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and desperation. "You came back. I knew you would. You had to. Because of them. Because of us." Thomas moved to block her path, his voice sharp. "Get out of my house. Now." Kimberly's expression twisted, her focus snapping back to Thomas. "This isn't your house, Thomas. You're just a shadow in it. A relic. Everything that matters in this family is standing right there." She pointed to James, her hand trembling. "He's the reason I did everything. It's always been him." James's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" Her gaze softened as she turned to him. "James, you know, you've always known. Everything I did, it was for you. For us." For us. James's voice was low and dangerous, his disbelief evident. You're delusional, Kimberly. No. She shook her head fiercely, stepping closer despite Thomas's warning glare. I did what I had to do. Pamela didn't deserve you. She couldn't see you the way I did. And those children were never meant to exist. Thomas's fists clenched, his voice taut with anger. What are you saying? Kimberly laughed, a hollow, brittle sound. Oh, come now, Thomas. You've already figured it out, haven't you? Pamela was weak. She didn't deserve the life she had. And when I realized she was going to have children, his children, I knew I had to act. You kidnapped them, James said, his voice cold as ice. You took Clara and Simon. Kimberly nodded, her eyes gleaming with a manic pride. Yes, I took them. I saved you from that life, James. I gave you freedom, but you left. You left me. Thomas stepped forward, his body taut with anger. Enough, he snapped. You don't get to rewrite history, Kimberly. Pamela loved James, and he loved her. Whatever you've done, it wasn't out of love. It was obsession. Kimberly's eyes darted to Thomas, narrowing. You never understood, she hissed. You always got in the way, just like Emma. At the mention of Emma's name, Thomas's breath caught. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice cold. She hesitated, and for the first time, fear flickered in her eyes. Emma was persistent, she said carefully. She came too close. She started visiting that orphanage too often, asking too many questions. Thomas's breath hitched. She knew. She suspected, Kimberly admitted, her voice hardening. She saw them, Clara and Simon, and something in her knew. She couldn't leave well enough alone. So, yes, Thomas, I dealt with her. I made sure she wouldn't interfere. James's face twisted in horror. You killed them. It was an accident, Kimberly snapped, her voice shrill. I didn't mean for Peter to... It wasn't supposed to happen that way. But she left me no choice. I had to protect what I'd done. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on all of them. Thomas's hands trembled at his sides, his mind reeling as the truth settled in. Emma, Peter, gone because of this woman. You're a monster, James spat, his voice filled with venom. Everything you've done, stealing those children, destroying Pamela, killing Emma and Peter, it's unforgivable. Kimberly's face crumpled, her desperation bleeding through. No, James, you don't mean that. I did it for you. Everything I did was for you. Can't you see that? James stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fury. I see exactly what you are, and you will never, never be a part of my life. Kimberly staggered back, as if struck, her expression crumbling into disbelief. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. You don't mean that. You can't. I do, James said coldly. You destroyed my family. You stole my children, and you killed my brothers. There's no coming back from that. Her breathing quickened, her gaze darting between James and Thomas. I had to, she whispered, her voice trembling. I had to. You'll understand someday. You'll see. Get out, Thomas said, his voice sharp and unwavering. If you take another step, I'll call the police. Kimberly froze, her wide eyes filled with panic and fury. You don't understand. None of you do. This isn't over. You'll see. You'll all see. She turned abruptly, her steps hurried and uneven as she fled the house, the door slamming shut behind her. For a moment, neither Thomas nor James moved, the echo of her words lingering in the heavy silence. Thomas's chest heaved as he fought to steady his breathing, his mind a storm of anger and grief. James sank into a chair, his face pale. She's insane, he murmured, his voice hollow. Thomas didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the door, his thoughts racing. Kimberly had taken everything from him, Emma, Peter, the peace of his family, and now she was still out there, unchecked, but not for long. "We'll stop her," Thomas said, his voice low but resolute. "No matter what it takes." The snowfall had thickened outside, muffling the sounds of the night. Kimberly hovered in the shadows near the Holland mansion, her breath ragged and her mind teetering on the brink of control. The echoes of James's rejection reverberated in her skull, each word twisting into something darker. He didn't mean it. He couldn't. Her lips moved soundlessly as she replayed the confrontation. James's fury, Thomas's accusations. They didn't understand. They never had. She had sacrificed so much for them. For him. Her heart pounded, the rhythm erratic as anger swelled, overtaking reason. Then, through the frosted window, she caught a glimpse of movement. A child's silhouette. Simon's. Kimberly's lips parted, and a manic light sparked in her eyes. If James wouldn't listen, she'd make him. Inside, Thomas sat in the living room, his fists clenched, his thoughts heavy. James paced by the fireplace, his hands running through his hair. The weight of Kimberly's confessions hung in the air, suffocating. "She's unhinged," James muttered. "She needs to be locked away." "She needs to be stopped," Thomas replied, his voice steely. His grief and anger burned beneath his words. "She admitted to killing them, James. Emma and Peter." James stopped, meeting his brother's gaze. "We'll stop her," he said firmly. A crash shattered the moment, a loud, jarring sound from upstairs. Both men froze before bolting toward the noise. Clara's scream pierced the hallway as Thomas and James reached the guest room. Kimberly stood in the center, her face wild, her coat streaked with snow. She clutched Simon's arm tightly, the boy wincing as he tried to pull away. "Let him go," Clara shouted, her small frame trembling as she stood between Kimberly and the door. "Stay out of this," Kimberly snapped, her eyes darting toward James as he and Thomas entered the room. Her grip on Simon tightened. "I'm taking him. He's mine. He's ours." "Kimberly, stop!" James's voice was sharp, his body tense as he took a cautious step forward. "Let Simon go." Kimberly's eyes locked onto him, her voice softening into a pleading tone. "James, this is for us. You'll see. I'll take him, and we'll start over. Just the three of us. We can be a family." "You're delusional," James said, his voice low and cutting. "Let him go now, or I swear I'll—" "Don't say that." Kimberly's voice cracked as she backed toward the door, dragging Simon with her. The boy whimpered, his eyes wide with fear. Thomas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Kimberly, look at him. You're hurting him. Let him go before this gets worse." "Worse?" Kimberly laughed, a brittle, fractured sound. "It's already worse. Do you think I wanted this? Any of this? I had to, Thomas. For James. For us. You didn't do this for anyone but yourself," Thomas said coldly. Kimberly's face twisted with rage. "Shut up," she screamed. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't understand." Simon took advantage of her distraction, yanking his arm free. Kimberly staggered back, her footing unstable. "Simon, run!" Clara shouted, rushing toward her brother. Kimberly lunged, her hands grasping wildly for the boy. "No, he's mine!" In the chaos, her momentum carried her backward, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She stumbled into the hallway, her arms flailing as she tried to regain balance. "Kimberly!" James shouted, rushing toward her. It was too late. Kimberly tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting as she hit the landing. The front door, still ajar from her earlier intrusion, let in a gust of cold air. Disoriented, she staggered to her feet and stumbled outside, her vision blurred, her mind a haze of fury and desperation. The blare of a truck's horn shattered the night. Thomas and James reached the doorway just as the truck's brakes screeched. Kimberly froze in the middle of the street, her eyes wide with terror. The impact was swift. Her body crumpled beneath the truck's force, thrown several feet before landing motionless on the snow-covered pavement. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stood frozen, his mind unable to process the scene before him. James leaned against the doorway, his shoulders heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "Simon!" Clara's voice brought them back. Thomas turned to see Clara cradling her brother. Simon was pale, clutching his arm, tears streaming down his face. "Are you okay?" Thomas knelt beside them, his hands trembling as he checked Simon for injuries. "My arm," Simon whimpered, holding it close to his chest. "It's broken," James said, crouching down beside them. "We need to get him to a hospital." Hours later, the family sat in the hospital waiting room. Simon had been treated and was resting, his arm in a cast. Clara sat beside him, her small hand gripping his uninjured one. "She's gone," James said quietly, breaking the silence. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. Kimberly's death had ended her reign of destruction, but the scars she left behind remained. "She can't hurt anyone else," James continued, his voice heavy with regret. "It's over." Thomas exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. "It's over," he repeated, though the words felt hollow. The shadows of the past had finally lifted, but the weight of their loss lingered. Together, they would heal. Together, they would rebuild. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the monitor and the occasional murmur of nurses in the hallway. Simon lay in the hospital bed, his small body cocooned in blankets, his arm in a bright blue cast resting on his chest. Clara sat in a chair pulled close to his side, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand lightly gripping his uninjured one. Thomas stood at the window, his gaze fixed on the snow falling softly outside. James sat on a small couch nearby, his head in his hands, his shoulders hunched under the weight of the past few hours. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The events of the night, Kimberly's intrusion, her sudden and violent death, still hung in the air, their effects rippling through the small family. Simon stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. His voice, small and groggy, broke the quiet. "Clara?" Clara lifted her head instantly, her tired eyes softening. "I'm here," she said, squeezing his hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere." Simon's gaze drifted to Thomas, then James, lingering on each of them before settling back on Clara. "Is she gone?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice low and reassuring. "Yes, Simon. She's gone. You're safe now." Simon's brow furrowed, his small face etched with worry. "She said she was going to take me." "She can't hurt you anymore," James said, his voice firm but tinged with regret. "You're safe. I promise." As the hours passed, the tension in the room eased slightly. Clara remained close to Simon, her protective instincts unwavering, while Thomas and James alternated between standing watch and quietly discussing what lay ahead. For Thomas, the realization of how much he had already grown to care for the children settled in. Every glance at Simon's fragile frame or Clara's quiet strength deepened his resolve. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about giving these children the family they deserved. James, too, felt the weight of his own failure lift slightly as he looked at Simon and Clara. He hadn't been there when they needed him most, but he was here now. He vowed silently to be the father they had been robbed of. Later that morning, Clara and Simon drifted into a peaceful sleep. Thomas and James stepped into the hallway, their footsteps soft on the polished floor. "They're stronger than I ever imagined," James said, leaning against the wall. Thomas nodded. "Clara's been holding them together. She's remarkable." James's gaze dropped, his expression darkening. They shouldn't have had to be this strong. I should have been there. I should have protected them. Thomas placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. You can't change the past, James. None of us can. But we can move forward. We can give them the life they deserve. James looked up, his jaw tightening with determination. You're right. I won't fail them again. Over the next few days, the hospital room became a space of quiet healing. Simon's color returned, his shy smile breaking through more often. Clara, though still guarded, began to relax, her sharp edges softening as she watched Simon heal under their care. One evening, as Simon dozed, Clara finally spoke up. I thought we'd never get away from her, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the cast around Simon's arm. James, sitting beside her, leaned forward. You're safe now, Clara. I promise you. Kimberly's gone. She can't hurt you or Simon anymore. Clara hesitated, her eyes searching his. You're our father, aren't you? James's breath caught and he nodded. Yes, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. I am. And I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you and Simon. But I'm here now, and I won't leave you again. Clara studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Good, she said simply, her voice soft but resolute. As Simon continued to recover, Thomas and James began the process of rebuilding trust and creating a new normal. The weight of Kimberly's actions lingered, but her absence also left room for healing. One afternoon, as the four of them sat together in the hospital room, Thomas pulled out an old photograph from his wallet. It was of Pamela, her smile bright and carefree, her arms wrapped around a much younger James and Thomas. Your mother, Thomas said, handing the photo to Clara. Clara stared at it for a long moment before passing it to Simon, who traced Pamela's face with his finger. She looks like Clara, Simon said softly. She does, James agreed, his voice filled with both sorrow and pride. Thomas leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. Pamela would have been so proud of both of you. She loved fiercely, just like Clara. And she would have adored Simon's kindness. The room fell quiet as they all reflected on the memory of Pamela. For the first time, the weight of her loss felt less like a wound and more like a reminder of the love she had left behind. That night, as snow began to fall again outside the hospital windows, the four of them sat together, a tentative but growing family. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. Thomas glanced at James, then at Clara and Simon, and allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Together, they would find a way to heal. Together, they would honor Pamela's memory by giving her children the life she would have wanted for them. And for the first time since losing Emma and Peter, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose, a chance to rebuild not just his family, but himself. A year had passed since that fateful night, and the Holland mansion stood transformed. Once cold and silent, it now radiated warmth and life. Golden light spilled from its tall windows, illuminating the snow-covered grounds. The echoes of laughter rang through its halls, carrying the sound of a family finding its way back to wholeness. In the living room, Clara adjusted Simon's tie, her movements deliberate, yet affectionate. Hold still, she said sternly, though her smile softened the words. Simon, now 6, wriggled in his chair, his cast long gone, but the memory of that night still faintly etched in his cautious eyes. It's too tight, he protested, tugging at the knot. You'll survive, Clara replied, stepping back to admire her handiwork. You look like a proper gentleman. Thomas entered the room, a tray of hot cocoa balanced in his hands. His smile widened as he saw the siblings, their bond as unshakable as ever. Ready for the big countdown? He asked, setting the tray on the coffee table. Simon nodded eagerly, while Clara gave a small shrug, though the excitement in her eyes betrayed her. James appeared from the hallway, shrugging on a dark blazer. His hair, now neatly trimmed, framed a face that looked lighter, less burdened by guilt. He paused for a moment, taking in the scene before him, Clara and Simon, laughing as they bickered over marshmallows. Thomas, looking more at peace than he had in years. "It feels good, doesn't it?" Thomas said quietly, noticing James's gaze. James nodded, his throat tightening. "Better than I deserve." Thomas clapped a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We've all made mistakes. But we're here now, and that's what matters." As midnight approached, they gathered on the terrace, the crisp winter air biting at their cheeks. The city skyline sparkled in the distance, a sea of lights mirroring the stars above. Simon held tightly to Clara's hand, his small fingers entwined with hers. Clara, in turn, gripped James's hand on one side and Thomas's on the other. For the first time in years, they felt whole. The countdown began, echoing faintly from the city below. 10, 9. Thomas glanced at Simon, whose face glowed with anticipation. He thought back to the moment he had found the children on that cold New Year's Eve. How lost they had seemed, and how lost he had been. It was almost impossible to believe how far they had come. 8, 7. James tightened his grip on Clara's hand, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pamela's face flashed in his mind, her laughter, her kindness. He hoped she could see them now, her children standing strong, surrounded by love. 6, 5. Clara turned her gaze upward, her sharp eyes catching the first spark of a firework exploding in the distance. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. 4, 3. Simon tugged at Thomas's sleeve. "Are the fireworks for us?" he whispered. Thomas knelt beside him, his voice low and warm. "They're for everyone, Simon. But tonight, they can be just for us if you want." 2, 1. Happy New Year. The sky erupted into color, a cascade of reds, blues, and golds, lighting up the night. Simon laughed, a pure, unrestrained sound, as he leaned into Clara. James watched them, his throat tight with emotion, while Thomas stood beside him, his heart full. For the first time in years, the Holland mansion brimmed with joy. Later that night, as the fireworks faded and the children fell asleep, Thomas and James sat by the fire, each nursing a glass of scotch. "We've come a long way," James said, his voice low. Thomas nodded, staring into the flames. "A year ago, I didn't think I'd ever find peace again. But those kids, they've changed everything." "They've given us a second chance," James agreed, "at family, at redemption." Thomas turned to his brother, his expression thoughtful. "Pamela would be proud of us, of them." James smiled faintly. "She would. And Emma, she would have loved them too." The mention of Emma brought a pang of sorrow, but it was no longer sharp. Instead, it felt like a quiet ache, a reminder of the love they had lost, but also the love they had found. "She would," Thomas said softly, his gaze distant. As the night deepened, the house grew quiet, the glow of the fire casting long shadows across the walls. Upstairs, Simon and Clara slept soundly, their dreams untroubled for the first time in years. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to that night a year ago, the chance encounter that had changed everything. He had been lost, drowning in grief and guilt, but Simon and Clara had pulled him out of the darkness. They had given him purpose, and in caring for them, he had found healing. The Holland family was no longer broken. They were stronger, bound by love and loss, by hope and second chances. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Thomas smiled to himself, The new year had begun, and with it a new chapter, a chapter filled with promise and the kind of joy he had once thought impossible. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would honor the memories of those they had lost. Together, they would move forward. For the first time in years, Thomas felt truly alive. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.